Hello, I'm Richard Hubbard. I work for one of the main contractors, a company called ISG, responsible for large construction projects around the world. And what I want to talk to you about today is what we can do about some of those shocking figures that actually the industry I work in is responsible for around carbon emissions. But more than that, the part that buildings play in society, in communities. And we know, as a company, we've done lots of research on this, and we know that buildings have the power to build communities. That sense of place was really tested in COVID, but our research shows that actually buildings are still necessary to build strong communities. But very much like the previous speaker, I just want to take you back a little bit to give you some context. So one of my peers in the industry talked to me about construction. I've been in the industry for about 12 years now. And he said, if you brought an ancient Egyptian to the modern day and you handed them a smartphone and you showed them all the things you can do on a smartphone, they would not be able to fathom how that's possible. It would be magic for them. If they saw a passenger jet flying over their head, they would cower, fall to their knees, and think some mythical beast had arrived. But if you walked them past the construction site, they would say, oh yeah, I know what that is. So therein is the problem. Construction and fisheries have been the slowest to adapt to new technologies and modern ways of working. But there is a quiet revolution going on, and that's a good thing because we've got some real problems. So construction is actually responsible for 40%, not 35%, of the carbon emissions from energy. Okay, so if we could get construction right, if we could tackle this, we would make significant advancements for the future of the planet. The other thing we need to appreciate is just building new things, however environmentally friendly they may be, still puts more embodied carbon into the environment. 80% of the buildings we need are already here that we will need in 2050. And they weren't built with the environment in mind, and they weren't really built with communities in mind. Maybe 50 years ago, people knew what buildings were. They'd walk down a street in London, they'd know who was occupying the building, the types of activities that go on in there. But I'm sure you're like me, if you walk past the tower now, you'd have virtually no idea, okay? And if you were living in that community, that wouldn't necessarily give you social value. So construction needs to find ways to deal with what we've already got and turn that into something of real benefit to society and that stops damaging the environment. So how are we going to do that? Well, I want to talk you through some projects that we've worked on, some of which are world first. Now, this building you can see here, really unremarkable looking thing, right? Not a particularly big project, I think it's about a £12 million conversion, which in construction, it's monopoly money. It's always big numbers, but that's not a particularly big project. This was a 1930s telephone exchange owned by the University of Cambridge, right in the middle of Cambridge. And it had been refurbed a couple of times, last time in the 90s. No consideration around the environment at that time. But the university took this building on, and they decided to make it effectively a net carbon zero building. So existing stock, just what I talked about, but to turn it into a net carbon zero. So how did they do that? Well, the first thing they did was to commit to a world first, a passive house in retrofit project. Effectively, what that means is a building that needs virtually no heating, no cooling, naturally ventilated, where the emphasis is on the fabric of the building, getting the fabric of the building right. So this building looks like an ordinary building, but as the hoarding says, is anything but. They adopted circular principles to the inside of the building. So inside the building is actually one of the big TV streaming companies' reception desk that we rescued from a previous project and put into this building. All of the lighting recertified. And by not building a new building, they saved 60,000 kilograms of carbon emissions going back into the building because it's already embodied in this existing building. By adopting the circular economy, they actually saved 20,000 kilograms of carbon emissions by reusing the reception desk, second-hand furniture, recertified lighting. But that is a world first, to be able to do that with that precision on a building. And we have 80% of the stock we need by 2050 that we have to use this approach on. So there's one thing. I think if we can learn to reuse what we've got. The other thing is, when we are planning new things, we need to start acting not as owners, but as custodians. And we need to have longer term thinking. So this is a building some of you might recognize. This was commissioned, again, it's one of our builds. This was commissioned by a large technology and engineering company as an innovation center. And it was going to be their offices, and there was a community hub in this building as well. Now, the building opened as one of the world's most sustainable builds. There are lots of ratings out, BREEAM, outstanding, etc. Highly sustainable building. But the problem was, people didn't come. People didn't want to see the innovation. It was, in quotes, a white elephant. So the building was empty for years. That was the second use. The only bit that stayed occupied was the community part of the building. That stayed in use. And then you may recognize it because it's now City Hall. That's the third use. But what we discovered when we went back to convert this building after building it into City Hall was it had fallen into disrepair. A building that had the potential to be virtually net carbon zero had fallen into disrepair. The systems hadn't been maintained. So imagine you spend £30 million building a building, but you don't even treat it like you would treat a car that you spend £30,000 on, where you would have it serviced, where you would check its emissions, where you would have it MOT'd, you'd look after it. So we have to start acting like a custodian. Buildings, what they are today, will not necessarily be what they are tomorrow. And this is where modularity needs to come in, and I'll explain a bit about that here. So I'm sure some of you would have seen this is the Atacama Desert in Chile. And this is where fast fashion that's unwanted ends up. It piles up, okay? And there are hundreds of thousands of tons of clothes with their labels in that nobody wanted. And they're built out of cheap materials, so they don't necessarily biodegrade. And we're actually still doing the same thing with buildings. We are building for demolition. So effectively, when a building has reached the end of its life, what can you do with it? You can knock it down. You may be able to reuse bits, but the bulk of it will go into landfill. We have to start to think of buildings as materials banks, okay? So materials banks where they are a collection of materials put together in a certain way that can be taken apart just like a Lego kit and become something else somewhere else. So we are starting to see our industry manufacturing parts of buildings in factories and then putting them together as modular builds. So a hospital may, in 5 years' time, become a school. You can take that apart, you can put it on the back of a hopefully electric lorry, drive those parts down the road, and turn that hospital maybe into 4 primary schools in different locations. We have to learn from fast fashion. We can't keep building cheap buildings that almost have built-in obsolescence that will then go into landfill. So that's the third lesson for construction. And I just want to leave you with those things. 8% of the buildings we need in 2050 are already here. We have to convert them to be great for communities, great for the environment. We have to think of ourselves as custodians. I always remember that Patek Philippe advert that where you never really own that watch. You just keep it for a period of time because it will be on the planet for thousands of years. We have to rethink the way we commission buildings, the way we conceptualize buildings. And we have to make buildings able to be taken apart and turned into something else. Buildings as materials banks, don't build for demolition. Thank you very much. Thank you.